We're very lucky today to have Benjamin van Rooij from the University of Amsterdam Law Department come and visit us. I first met Benjamin during COVID, actually. We co-presented a joint seminar on behalf of the Australian-New Zealand School of Government. We were both doing research on compliance, actually, around COVID and why people were following rules and not following rules. And I think, Benjamin, you were a little bit intrigued by the level of lockdowns we had here and the incredible rules. I think Melbourne was perhaps officially the most lockdown city in the world in terms of the strictness, but we were also fairly generally quite compliant as well, which is an interesting case study, I'm sure. We're really lucky. Ben happened to be in town and got in touch with me and said he'd be happy to come along and talk to us, and agreed to do a seminar, and in particular talk about a topic that's dear to his heart around why organisations do the things they do, and including when they do things that are not great, and to try and unpack some of that. It's the topic of his latest book, which I'm sure he'll mention during his presentation. And I'll hand the floor over to you.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm very happy to engage both with the Institute and also Behaviour Works Australia. For me, the sort of work that's done in Australia around behavioral science and the application of it towards practice is inspirational, and I also hope to engage more with that in the future. The project I'm presenting today is, and maybe you can go to the next slide, sort of starts with an understanding that I think we all have when we open our newspapers, that there is structural harm, and that is not just individual, but it also emanates, operates, is stimulated by maybe scaled up through organizations. And in my next slide, in my work before this, I try to understand a sort of more the individual side of compliance. So the behavioral code, it's a popular science book I did together with Adam Fine. It focuses largely on the different sort of motivational and situational influences on individual behavior, both criminal behavior as well as other kinds of harmful behavior. And we also have a handbook of compliance that has some of the organizational stuff and a methods book on how to study this. But what I was lacking, maybe next slide, is a view on what in its very nature are organizations doing in this. And as I was going back into the literature on organizations, I noticed organizations play a vital role in making humans successful. If you look at Yuval Harari's work, sort of historically arguing that our ability to cooperate and to form larger forms of cooperation beyond, let's say, 20 people, to scale up to far more, has made Homo sapiens more successful than the other species of humans. And we see that over time. And how do we do that? We pool resources to organization, we have joint values, so we'll think the same, it coordinates action. The problem is everything that's good about organizations can also multiply bad. And that's sort of the core premise of the book that I've been developing. Next slide, please. And I'm doing this together with Nicholas Lord of the University of Manchester, who is a white-collar criminologist and sociologist. And we, in this book, have been a bit weird in how we do this. So this is not a purely scientific endeavor. I originally had planned to do this more scientifically, in the sense that we wanted to do methodologically sound case studies, that we would do causal process tracing, which is a qualitative technique one can use, to do the individual studies to understand sort of, okay, what were the organizational root causes that lead to the structural misconduct in the case. The problem is, we found as we were starting this project, one of my PhD students, she is doing this for the NYPD and violence. She can only get to 2 processes in 4 years. So the amount of work it would have probably taken with the sorts of money we could get, probably taken 30 years to scale it up. So I decided, okay, let's do it in a different way. Let's just see, we already have a large number of very well documented case studies. What happens if we read those? If we put about 30 of them together, what are the things that we see very inductively? And what is a bit different, I think, from the other scientific methods here, is that the sort of sample you get through this is very hard to get to through traditional, I would say, more rigid methods. It's impossible to do experiments in these organizations that I'm talking about. It's nearly impossible to do good surveys at the time things were happening. You can do them afterwards once the scandal has hit, but over that period. So we are, in a sense, and that's the methodological major limitation of all of this work in organizations, we're all blind men in the elephant. So the sort of work that's very strong causally on organizational issues is often done in labs with students, which doesn't really generalize this. The chronological work, even, it uses the quantitative work, it uses data sets from regulators, for instance, that don't necessarily capture those organizations that are able to evade inspections or that are able to hide things. And some of these worst organizations, they were not on the sides of the regulators. So a horrible example is, for instance, the Madoff case. I mean, the SEC went by Madoff twice to actually go through everything, and they never went to look at the 17th floor where they had actually hidden the whole operation of what was happening. So what I'm presenting to you, and I know most of you, at least in the room, are all scholars, is not only a scholarly endeavor. It's not fully, it has major limitations. So I can't say that any word that I use that's causal, I can evidence that the causality there, nor can I generalize what I say. What I can try and do here is say, okay, maybe we are developing certain hypotheses that we're exploring through these cases that maybe we can find out later to test them better. The other thing that I did think we were going to do, and there's a book that just came out, The Dark Pattern does that more. They are more based on traditional behavioral economics and behavioral ethics, and they sort of build sort of a model of what a negative organization was, and then they use that to analyze cases. What we do is the opposite. We are fully inducted, try and understand the cases, then we see certain patterns, and I today will describe these patterns to you. And then we do link certain types of theories, mostly from criminology, to sort of position them and explain them better. So at the start, I'm sorry for how faulty the project is. The audience is also not academic. So the audience is a broader audience outside even a popular audience, because we're all part of this. So that's the big caveat. So what we did is we selected cases, both public and private organizations, where we've seen structural misconduct. Some of these you know very well. Volkswagen, does anybody know when Volkswagen was for the first time caught and punished for cheating on its pollution emissions? The first time, I'm asking.
Like the...
That was the last major case. The first time, anybody? Yes.
Probably soon after they were founded, I'm guessing.
1973.
Yeah, there you go.
73. The EPA already then found. So what we're interested in are longer term, structural, going on over years, spread out in the company. So that's selection criteria one, if I'm going to put it as a selection criteria. The second, has to be available information. Most of these cases have very good investigative journalism, and often there's also good court records and even historical records. Just a summary of what I'll talk about today. We find 5 different things that I'll talk about today. Some of these things may seem immediately, sure, we know that. What the book does and tries to do is go deeper into the patterns and variation that we see in the cases of these things. So let's just go into it. So to start on unrealistic goals. So Wells Fargo, I don't know how much of you know of these sorts of cases, but Wells Fargo, they had a new policy somewhere late 1990s, and it was called Going for Great, and great was spelled GR8. They were saying that each bank employee had to sell 8 products on average to each client. So let's say you're a bank employee, and I come to your bank and I'm like, I want to open an account. You're happy, you've sold me 1 product. I'm like, okay, I want a credit card too. You're at 2. I want a car insurance. You're at 3. All right, I'll change my home insurance. You're at 4. You still got to sell me 4. So here we have something that wasn't really possible to do. And not surprisingly, a lot of bank employees started to cut corners. They opened credit cards or insurance without authorization from clients, and they even opened fake accounts. And this was at such a scale that at some point 65,000 employees were fired once the scandal broke, and there were millions of fake and unauthorized accounts, also damaging the people there. So here we have something where the original goals were a problem. They were very hard to reach. There's an influential theory in sociology that later was further developed in criminology called strain theory. And it basically says if the means you have that are available to you are insufficient to reach the goals that you want to reach as an individual, you're going to develop negative emotions. And those negative emotions make you more likely to become deviant. So originally it's an individual level theory that has been used. It's not easy to evidence, but it's been used as one of the major theories in criminology to explain both individual violent crime, but also white-collar crime. We can also apply to organizations. What we see in the cases, nearly every case we have has unrealistic targets. However, what we do in each chapter of the book is we don't just immediately say that this is bad, because organizations need to be ambitious. There's a book called Moonshot, for instance. It makes a whole argument about ambition and how we as humans, if we reach for literally, well, the moon, not the stars, but if we reach for the stars, we can do things we could not do before. There's also famous things, for instance, when the 4th minute mile was first broken in running, suddenly many more people could break it. And suddenly you see that it's possible, but also you have to imagine that it's possible to even start doing it. So there is a reason we have ambition. Legally speaking, it's allowed to be ambitious, also at a level where it's unrealistic. Another thing about unrealistic targets that make it so hard is there are things literally in the C-suite. It's the CEO, CFO, they're dealing with it. Normally people dealing with behavior are compliance officers, etc. They may talk about incentives, structures, rewards. They hardly ever talk about the goals. Can you imagine if you are one of the people in charge of conduct in a bank like Wells Fargo, that you go to the CEO and say, look, you got to bring that number 8 back to, well, the industry average at the time was 1.6, let's bring it back to 2. What would be the result? The result would be the share price would plummet. And there would be all kinds of results, and probably the CEO would never listen to you. It's nearly impossible to talk about this, yet I find in case after case a problem. VW wanted to create a clean diesel engine. It didn't have the technology for in cars that didn't fit that technology. So there was another way out. Boeing wanted to have a fuel-efficient plane built on a plane from the 1960s. So the engine was so large compared to the plane that it had more upward force, and it wanted to do it in such a way that pilots from airline companies didn't need to go into expensive training in competition with Airbus. Result was there was a software system in it, the MCAS system, that pilots were not trained to even know or knew how to operate. So it just didn't work at the basis. BP had 25% budget cuts as a strategy from the 1990s, even though it went into more high-risk oil exploration, and it had very outdated equipment in its refineries and its pipelines, leading to massive spillage in Alaska, years after years, and massive explosions and people dying in, for instance, the Texas refinery. And I don't need to explain what happened in the Gulf of Mexico. These targets also become more problematic through incentives. I don't need to say much about incentives because we understand incentives, but just examples. Purdue Pharma had the Toppers program that made its sales reps just be more aggressive to outsell other sales reps because they would get larger bonuses, even if it meant that they were actually selling to pill mills. And they were aware of that, so they were contributing directly to the opioid epidemic. We see it in major banking cases like the LIBOR rigging case, where again, we see that there were major bonuses. What's interesting about our set of cases, we also see it outside of capitalist systems. If you look at, for instance, what happened at Chernobyl, the whole pushing that night of finishing the test, even though that was the wrong team, and there were several reasons not to do it that night, which was one of the problems, not the biggest problem, was because one of the leaders was about to get the High Order of Lenin. It's not only financial bonuses; there's other bonuses. If you look at the Great Leap Forward, the biggest famine that we have in the history of humanity, we see that the Communist Party at the time also created all kinds of incentives, backed up often by violence, so that makes it way worse. But it also created a structure where the incentives were about competition. And that's another interesting thing here, that you get goal inflation. Maybe your goals to start with are realistic, but if the incentive works through competition, at some point you're reaching a level that nobody can attain anymore. What we also see, especially in public organizations, is goal displacement. This is the idea that was developed by Robert Merton, a sociologist, that what are the official, the sort of original goals become displaced by goals of things that maybe you can measure. So a good example, for instance, is how police, who has the original goal, have to reduce crime, which, by the way, is very, very difficult. It's sort of evidence that policing actually helps reduce crime if you don't address all the other issues. So that's a goal that's hard in of itself, but what happens then? It becomes measured through arrests. So you get then these arrests that then easily lead to the sorts of arrests that maybe don't have a lot of suspicion or where there's more false planting of evidence. Good examples are both in the Baltimore PD case and the Oakland PD case that we've looked at. And finally, there's short-termism. And Boeing here is the poster child. I mean, Boeing has been successful since the 1950s because it wasn't the first that built a commercial jet airliner. That was the Havilland in England, but theirs blew up. It exploded. Boeing, the 707, they tested the cabin pressure, for instance, 1,000 times and made costly changes in the technology of the cabin in order to ensure it was safe. And that's rational. It's rational if you're going to build a plane that your only business model works if it's safe. But after the merger between Boeing and McDonnell Douglas, things changed. They became increasingly focused on the everyday share price, increasingly cost cutting. So there is a sort of short-termism that in the long run doesn't work. Obviously, an airline company cannot in the long run survive. So with goals, we see a first layer. And as I said, it's not easy to address goals, partly because they're in a different power structure than where normally the sort of behavioral teams work. Second, they also exist in a larger market economic place where shareholder value has become increasingly important, where there's limited liability for damages. But also where, because of derivatives and ever faster trading, sort of connection between the ownership and the product is more and more delinked. Also, the sort of understanding of what the product and the risk are by the owners is more and more delinked. And then if you get the people in charge of setting targets more listening to the owners rather than to where the product itself is, it becomes harder to actually deal with the risk. So those make it even harder to deal with it. So that's the sort of goal. You're looking at an actual slide here that Don Paris, who was an engineer in the Texas refinery of BP, sent to leadership at BP. And if you read underneath the slide, it has these 10 names. It says, everyone shown here expected to go home at the start of what turned out to be their last day at work. This was a cœur de cri, as they say in France, a last attempt by this engineer. Please, 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 please invest in safety. He already pointed out to what eventually would be an accident killing another 10 people, were structural unsafety issues because the refinery that BP had acquired earlier was completely outdated. It needed a lot of updating, and they did the opposite. They cut 25% costs. This is a good example of people in organizations having access to information about risk. And yes, they can at times speak out. So one could say, okay, they're successful, they've spoken out. What happens in this case, though, is there was no follow-up. He wasn't listened to. No change was made. Worse, after the accident, Don Paris and people like him were actually by the authorities held co-accountable because they knew. So that's an interesting thing, and it shows some aspects of silencing. Silencing, and we see that with many of the mechanisms that we discuss in the book, is not just passive. Sorry, is not just active. When we think of silencing, we either think of a culture of fear or we think of retaliation, and those are things that are happening. But there's more at play. First of all, there may simply be a complexity of the risk. So I've looked at cases of dangerous chemical products like Monsanto and 3M. If you look at Monsanto, for instance, the workers in factories and people living next to factories that made PCBs from the 50s onwards, it took them ages to understand what the risks were. And my PhD work was in a village next to a chemical fertilizer plant. And I have spent years and years and years sort of trying to understand why these people who were all getting sick never took any action. The sort of causalities of linking weird diseases as they start happening to actually things that are happening in the plant are very difficult. So there's the complexity of risk. Second is the access to information about the risk. In the Monsanto cases, and there's several, there's the dioxin, there is the PCBs, there's Roundup. In those cases, and then there's 3M with PFAS, we see ironically that the organizations have information that allow the causal link to be made, which we can no longer make now. Why can't we make a causal link, for instance, with PCBs or with dioxin? Especially dioxin and PFAS, because it's in everybody's body. There's no control group anymore. But they have data from 1950s or 40s from their own factories where they can still analyze the sort of linkages that there are. So if there's a lack of access to information, it becomes very difficult for people to actually start to speak out. Another good example is Chernobyl. There were 16 structural design errors in the plant. The people that were making the decision that pushed the fatal button that led to the explosion, they didn't know what was wrong in that basic design, why a sudden halting of the reaction would actually trigger a stronger reaction. They were never told. They never had the information to actually make an informed decision about their own safety. Habituation of risk, I don't think I need to say much about, but you can imagine if every day you are seeing certain things happening, you become inert to it. The groupthink one is quite interesting, and this is, I think, the only place where we cite a law review article. There's a really good law review article about Enron that uses the psychological idea of groupthink and applies it to the board at Enron. Enron was a energy company, and they had this whole thing in the board where they just didn't want anybody to ruin the party. All positive thinking. And also there was a massive hubris. They literally said to each other, we're on the side of angels. And that led them to completely miss the signals that the accounting was completely wrong. And that led to the bankruptcy of that company with a lot of damages. Then there is the retaliation against those that speak out. That's sort of where we are thinking when we're thinking about silencing. And yes, there are many examples of that. One example we discussed in the book is how Liz Cheney, after she spoke out after January 6th, because we did use the Republican Party as a case, and it's a complex case because is it an organization or not, but we sort of argue it is. She was completely retaliated against, not only by the national level leadership, but also by her own state level. She was kicked out of the party, etc., etc. There are many other examples. Then we also see that there is organizations that are really set up to silence, either proactive or either intentionally or not. The Catholic Church, for instance, another case where you have structural abuse, it's sort of in its NDA as one of the books on the Catholic Church, a really good sociological analysis with a focus on Ireland, but also other cases. It says, look, it was a total institution. You enter the institution in the seminary and you learn from those days onwards to devote yourself as loyalty to that church and not to undermine it. And part of that was also not speaking out against it. But we also see, for instance, that legal organization can be used, such as NDAs. So in the Fox case, where there were cases against Roger Ailes, the CEO, there were NDAs. And what shocked me, I have not studied NDAs as closely before. Some of these NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, they said you're not allowed to disclose that there was an NDA. And finally, we have also active repression of information. So we see that in 3M and PFAS. You see that when researchers in 3M, for instance, found out, there's a really good article in ProPublica that was also published in the New Yorker. That's a 15-page analysis of this researcher who at some point found out that everybody's body had PFAS. And her own company just had all these doubts of her work, even though they knew, her bosses knew. And finally, she was put in a lower position and she found out actually this has happened before, 10 years before, to another researcher. And it was a pattern of actually when information about the risk came out, of repressing that and putting it on the back burner. Silencing seems to be completely negative. But if you think about what an organization is, actually, organizations can't be fully transparent. They need trade secrecy, they need privacy, but even more fundamentally, hierarchy comes with pockets of intransparency. Both at the top, people at the top have power because they have certain information people lower don't have. On the other hand, practically, people lower in an organization have information that people at the top will never have. So that's sort of transparency. So that's what we do in every chapter. We do think, okay, this is not as easy. Next slide. We then move to the next part, which is organizations create opportunities for harm. And there's a large body in criminological work, which is called opportunity criminology, which sort of says people can commit crime because they have an opportunity to do that. It's not easy to commit crime. If you look at the USA gymnastics case with Larry Nasser here in the background, he has been found to have sexually abused 160 women in USA athletics. It's very unlikely that as a private individual, he would ever been able to do that in the way that he did it. He had an organizational position of power and trust in which he had access to vulnerable women who needed him. If you look at the documentaries or the books about this, what you see is that these women actually were, and this links it back to targets, they were expected to perform at levels that really hurt their bodies in many levels. And he had ways, he wasn't only harassing them, he also was helping them deal with pain and also being there as an ear sort of against their coaches. So he was in that position, but he was a predator. So organizations, they help things scale up. That's the positive side of them. They provide a larger scale. If they're successful, but with a larger scale also comes a higher risk. So if we unpack that a bit, we have two sort of core patterns. One is what criminologists call the routine activity theory pattern. And routine activity theory is based on the idea, it's very similar to this, that crime occurs when a committed offender has easy access to a valuable target and there's no guardianship. We can apply that easily to the Me Too cases, but we can also expand that a little bit. For instance, if we look at the LIBOR rate rigging, so the rigging of the interbank interest rate, we see, for instance, at USB, the Swiss bank, that the traders stood to get massive bonuses and also make a lot of money for the bank. They were put in the same room as the people that would submit the rate of the interbank rate, which was determined by submitters from several banks together. They were in the exact same room. There was no Chinese wall. I've worked in Clifford Chance in the 1990s. We had Chinese walls for that kind of stuff. I mean, these complete conflict of interest, and it was normalized. I'll talk about that later. What we can also see in some cases is that we don't have the traditional everything happening in the organization. We can also see that there can be targets outside of the organization. If you look at the police case for Baltimore, the organization, the Baltimore PD and the law gives the police a position of power to start abusing citizens and actually extorting them, which happened a lot in Baltimore. We can also see that sometimes the organization becomes the target. In money laundering cases, such as HSBC in Mexico, the Sinaloa cartel, it targeted HSBC, which came in when it took over a Mexican bank. Suddenly they had access to US dollar accounts in the Caymans, which was amazing. And HSBC didn't have the guardianship in place to actually protect itself from them. So that's the first pattern. The second pattern is the scale of harm. And the best way I can explain that is to say, okay, some of these organizations are extremely successful. Think about Monsanto and Roundup. We would not have the food production today if it wasn't for things like Roundup. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to grow vegetables. I do. It's frustrating. It's really frustrating. You get a bug here, bug there, and you have to weed the whole time. With Roundup, you just put the modified seeds in. They're immune to Roundup. You spray the shit out. Sorry, and you spray everything, and voila, only your seeds come up. I mean, if you look at the numbers, 50% of all planted acres of corn and soy in the US have been sprayed with Roundup, produced by Monsanto. 130 pounds of glyphosate per square mile was sprayed in 2019. They're amazing numbers, but then you do want to be sure that the product is safe. If you think, for instance, about a PFAS, I mean, it's everywhere. There's prevalence in 45,000 surface and groundwater samples across the globe. If I look at eggs, so I've chickens in the Netherlands. I am no longer allowed in the Netherlands to eat my own free-range chicken's eggs. Why? Because they eat worms, and worms store PFAS better in their protein. So my eggs are less healthy, or actually very unhealthy. If you look at Boeing, Boeing has 42% of the market share of all airplanes, all commercial air jets. So all of that, you can say, if something goes wrong in a skill you have like that, bam, it's massive. If Boeing just made 3 hobby planes, who cares about their safety? So there's a larger risk of it becoming larger. What we also see is that organizational power creates impunity. The good case we discussed here is how Harrods was able to shield Al-Fayed from years and years of having abused the women that worked at Harrods. And there's good examples of that. We see it with HSBC as well, that used its linkage to the British government to sort of put pressure on US regulators and even the US Department of Justice to give them a very favorable deferred prosecution agreement. So organizational scale gives power. And finally, yes, we see some organizations, the organization in of itself creates an opportunity. And those are organizations that we are not focused on because they're sort of already not normal organizations. So Madoff, for instance, which I think was more a criminal enterprise than a legitimate organization, and Theranos. They were all set up as an organization to fool investors. But again, they couldn't have done it in themselves. Bernie Madoff, without the full organization, couldn't have done what he did. It needed a scale. The sort of conclusion from opportunity is, instead of looking at why things occur, we have to look at how they occur. And that's a really important thing. We have to understand the organizational mechanisms that enable the conduct to occur, not just incentivize it, as we've talked about so far. Yes. So then we look at the next thing that organizations do. Organizations socialize people. It's one of the core things they do. If you become a member of a new organization, you're socialized by them. Nowhere is that clearer than in military or police organizations. So here you have the graduating class of the Baltimore PD. And the Baltimore PD, sorry, Oakland PD is a horrible case where we see over 100 years of structural police abuse and racist police abuse, which is linked also with broader societal changes in the Bay Area. I won't go into that. But what you see is there's a very good book called Writers Come Out at Night, where 2 investigative journalists have really traced this history and also in depth have looked at the organizational processes. And what you see at the Oakland PD that happened is they both in the police academy socialized and normalized actually deviant thoughts on violence, but especially during the training in the first months at work. So this is one story of one cop who just graduates from the police academy. He then is assigned a training officer. It's a bit like the movie Training Day. I don't know if you've seen that. And that officer tells him the first day, by the end of today, you will have beaten up somebody. So they get their first call. They drive out. It's 2 African-American men. They're called because there had been a burglary. So they were victims. One of them has a dog. The senior officer says to that man in an aggressive way, lock up the dog or I will shoot it. So he's threatening them immediately. This ends in that man saying something back. He gets beaten up. And then they write up a false testimony that he resisted arrest. This is the first hour on the job for the cadet. He describes the first 2 weeks. Next day, they actually do kill a dog. Within 2 days, he is asked to plant false evidence. And he's also shown that A, this is normal. He sees everybody doing it. B, he's also shown, if you don't join, we don't trust you. You need to get your hands dirty, then you're one of us. If you're not one of us, we're not going to be there for you on the street. And we can say a lot about Oakland, but Oakland at the time wasn't really safe. So as a cop, if you don't have the back of other cops, you're physically unsafe. So there's a socialization here happening. And yes, we can look at that psychologically. I mean, we know that very well. If you see others doing something, you're going to be more likely to do it. And if others think something is okay, you're also more likely to think it okay. But there's an organizational side to this as well. First of all, we see organizations, and again, it's active and passive. The passive side is they just don't respond to harmful conduct. What happens then? There is no norm set, and the norm erodes, and it normalizes. Then we see, and we see this, for instance, in HSBC that just didn't respond to any money laundering signals. Oakland PD didn't hold cops accountable. Of course, we also see it in the Catholic Church. I mean, there have been priests who have again and again and again been placed from one parish to the other, to the other, to the other, even though the organization knew something was wrong in the first one and the second one. So that's already a level deeper. You're not just not responding, you're actually allowing it to continue, and everybody can see that. We see that also in USA gymnastics. If we go to the next level, at some point we get teaching misconduct. That's what the example I just gave from the Oakland PD. And we also see there's contagion effects. It spreads in organizations, but also between organizations. Most car companies, not just VW, started to cheat on emissions. And we use, I won't go into details now, a sociological idea from DiMaggio and Powell called institutional isomorphism to sort of trace this both in, for instance, the Catholic Church as well as in the car companies. And finally, yes, at some point we can call this a culture. And when I started this project, I thought I was going to really talk about culture, but I've sort of gone back from that. There's a problem with this. If we look at the Wells Fargo case and we look at reports in newspapers about Wells Fargo, it's been called a corruption culture, a rotten culture, a cutthroat culture, a toxic culture, a culture of greed, a culture of silence, and a culture of fear. I've spent a lot of time trying to understand what we mean by an organizational culture. I've also been trained more in legal anthropology. And what I see, what actually a culture is, in its essence, it is also about shared understandings of a reality that are also transmitted from generation to the next. If I look at most aspects where we are talking about culture, we cannot establish that very easily. And we use it very easily. And it sort of becomes, I would say, it's sort of defeatist thing. Oh, it's culture, we cannot do anything about it. It becomes a simplifying thing, and it also becomes something where it sort of shifts away it from anybody that actually did something. And I'm not saying that culture doesn't matter. It's deeply, deeply important. But it can also mean that we're not looking at the actual traits in organizations that are at play at first that may become cultural. So I'm sort of warning, we shouldn't be using the word culture too easily. And if we do, please can we do ethnography? And I know that's very expensive, and we're probably only going to do it in the worst cases like these. But that's why we argue for what we call a forensic ethnography. I'm coming to the last mechanism now. Yep. Sorry for the horrible picture. And this is not the actual picture of the case, but this is what I imagine it looked like. Something weird happened in January 2018. A report came out that Volkswagen, after it had already been caught red-handed in cheating on its emissions, it had been doing something. It had been putting monkeys in plastic cages, breathing in fumes from two cars. One was a Ford 150 pickup truck from the 1940s with just normal gas, with a big V8 engine or V6 engine or whatever they have in those cars. And the other was a clean V12 with clean diesel. And Volkswagen was doing that. And God, I would love to interview the people who were behind this, how they got in the room and thought this was a good idea. The idea was, well, we can sort of say it's not as bad as it was. Yes, we did it, but it's not harmful. Actually, the test failed because the monkey it was very bad for them to also breathe from the clean diesel. But it shows something that organizations, next slide, they defend themselves. And that's also legitimate. There's nothing wrong with defending yourself. You are entitled legally, PR, but it can very much backfire. And here we use another idea from criminology that you can, which is called neutralization. It's a little bit similar to moral disengagement, which is more a behavioral economics term, but it predates it by several decades, and it has a very large body of work. And it's shown that there are techniques through which individuals can neutralize ex ante or expose the shame and guilt of engaging in deviant or criminal behavior. We can apply that again to organizations. Organizations use these techniques. So what we see is they deflect blame to employees or people outside the organization. It wasn't us, it was just a couple of rogue employees. Happens in many of these cases. Worst cases, they blame the victims. Purdue Pharma, oh, yes, it's these patients, they're abusing drugs. I mean, it's not addictive, it's how they're using it. It's not how we designed it. Well, they're not using it in the right way. So then it even gets to a denial of victimhood. At some point, they're blaming the victim. There's also denial of harm. Good example is BP after Deepwater Horizon. They first announced just a couple of barrels, and then at some point, I don't know if you still remember, we got the video footage, and some people started to calculate, and they had to admit higher and higher numbers. And at the end, you know what they said? Well, the ocean is very big. So, and with all these things, we see because they keep on deflecting, not only it makes it easier for people to still work there. And big tobacco is the best example where by muddying the science from the 1950s onwards, they didn't just have an external audience, but also an internal audience. So employees at big tobacco companies, for instance, in the book, The Golden Holocaust, which sort of describes the history of tobacco harm, they, for themselves, started to buy into this to sort of feel okay by still working for big tobacco. Finally, we see that another technique is used is accusing the accusers. Most clearly, we see this obviously now in the current Trump administration, where you sort of go after the people that accuse you. And again, that's a neutralization technique. What's the problem in all of this? I don't think in the worst cases we are seeing an actual neutralization of shame and guilt. I'm pretty sure that people in Boeing have some shame and guilt after the crashes, etc. I'm pretty sure even in Monsanto and other cases. It's not what I see in the literature. What I see is they just don't learn from the scandals because you're driving it away. So that's the main talk I had today. I'll just put some thoughts out there for discussion in the end. You can just link it. So I've talked about 5. The book also covers leadership in this, and they're involved in many of these things. The most important thing is that we get a disconnect sometimes between what the leaders say and actually what, through these other things, they have people do. So there is an idea of tone at the top and smell at the bottom. And yes, there's the broader economic, social, and governance context, which is a headache. I tried in one chapter to write about this. But the most shocking things are, especially in the governmental context. For instance, the FAA, Federal Aviation Authority, they're completely beholden by Boeing and it's sort of integrated into it. Or the EPA and the FDA colluding and collaborating with Monsanto to actually publish a false analysis of data that Monsanto had about risks of certain of their substances. So sometimes it's broader than that, and that makes it harder to deal with. Final slide. Yeah. There's one more slide. Yeah, thank you. So the first question is probably the most important one. So let's assume, and that's a big if, but if the things I talked about today are similar to root causes of big scandals, let's say if they do generalize to other future potentially worst cases, how can we then have interventions that focus on the root causes? What I see and what I've argued across several articles is that on the legal side, we have sort of this palette of interventions. I don't even know where they come from. Some are age-old, like fines or jail time, sort of short forms of punishment. Some are sort of new, where we're saying, well, we need to have a compliance management system or a monitor. But they're interventions. They're not based on root causes. What I try and argue is saying, okay, let's try and focus on the root cause and then see which interventions we already have, we can adapt to that, and maybe what others we need. So a good example are targets. If you don't address the targets and you let those in place, so to speak, then all the other things are rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, as Americans would say. So that's the thing I'm grappling with. How can we make this more central? But that also links to, okay, can we actually, do we have enough evidence? Sure, I can tell these nice stories and it's nice to talk about these things. At the level I'm at now, I would say what I can do with what I have now is start a conversation. Don't use this normatively to predict risk. I'm very worried also about that a regulator would say, well, there's these 5 things, and if there are more of that, then we're going to do X. But I do think they're good for conversation starters. The final one is more internal for us as researchers. As I said, we're blind man in the elephant. I can know in the worst cases sort of that some of these things have happened. I can make arguments based on a linkage to theory, but I can't link it very well to existing other data sets because the samples are so different. They have samples of students, they have samples of average companies, they have samples of governmental data that is not as in-depth into the organizational processes. So we're literally blind man in the elephant. And that's sort of my sort of call is, okay, how can we solve this? So those are the things I just wanted to lay out there. And I'm going to grab a glass of water. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Benjamin. I guess we give you a round of applause. Look, really fascinating topic, and we actually only have a few minutes for questions, but
Sorry.
I'm sure that there might be a few that linger on, and maybe people can get in touch with you.
Of course, yes. If you can put the last slide, they can see my email.
Yeah, so down the bottom right of this slide, you can see email. So perhaps if anyone's online and they have a question for I've been calling you Benjamin. Ben, sorry, it's been all right.
Oh, good. Oh, good.
Look, fascinating. We do have a bit of time for questions, and I really like the questions you posed at the end. I guess from a behavioural science point of view, we view the world as individuals doing things, and organisations going right or wrong, or is a bunch of individuals doing individual acts. And what we tend to see inside organisations is they actually often they escalate. So so a small thing will let go, and when we see organisations with notionally poor culture, it's because someone abused someone, or someone wrote an email in capital letters, or someone made a sexist remark and it wasn't acted on. And then that gets accepted, and then it escalates. And almost invariably, when you track it back, it starts, at one person doing something that was let go. So from a behavioural science point of view, my answer to that would be, well, there must be a path out as well that's behavioural. And we need to articulate that and try and answer it. So maybe that's a comment more than a question.
No, it's great. I would say that's one sort of pattern that might fit some of the case. So this links very much to a case we had in my law school, where a labor law professor gradually sexualized his department, leading to 5 pages in the NRC, our major newspaper, about that case. So it was a scandal. I would say in some of the other cases, if you look at, for instance, like a Monsanto or a Chernobyl, that's not sort of gradual, whatever. There are certain mistakes, sometimes technological mistakes made, sometimes, or if you look at for instance, Boeing, where this change in thinking about sort of short-term profit just came with a merger, and there were just deep in the board were different people who cared about different things. And I do think with all of those things, yes, you can add or combine things I said with behavioral science, because I mean setting targets, those are decisions, and decisions is behavioral science. So I think, yes, I do think it can be integrated, but I think the patterns aren't always sort of the sort of blind spots sort of pattern with good people doing bad things. I think there's variation there. And I think that's where the blind spot in behavioral science is. Behavioral science doesn't normally look at these cases for what they are, except to sort of find what they've already been studying in their own data.
Was there a question there, Rob, and then Steph?
Yeah, thanks.
Oh, I'm sorry, there's one online. So maybe 3 questions. We'll get to your question, waiting in a second.
Great presentation. You got 2, but I'll start with 1 and see how we go. And it's really talking to your, I guess, your methodological questions, and you opened up with a major qualification about maybe the methodological. You were a bit critiquing yourself, and I would say, rather than critiquing yourself, which is talking the research down a bit, there's a whole bunch of qualitative research methodologies that you can actually rely on that have a quality criteria that you can use to then strengthen why this is a good approach. So if you haven't looked into that, I would recommend that. But following from that would be a question which somewhat called the principle of symmetry.
Yeah.
And it goes back to your selection of case studies.
Yeah.
So ideally, if you develop, I think you're inductively developing a theory of explanation of why, what are the root causes of bad behavior. So it seems to me you've selected case studies of organizations that show bad behavior.
Yep.
So, but I would say if you also use the same 5 principles to look at organizations that didn't do bad behavior, you can't really know for sure whether those are the 5 ones that matter. Because if you would find 5 same ones in another organization that didn't do bad behavior, then you're not so certain anymore. So
that's a very good question
on symmetry.
So I have a very simple answer to that. That's ExxonMobil. So I used to think after Valdez happened, the big spill, there's a lot of evidence that Exxon completely changed and became fully safety focused. So I used to sort of say, okay, there's good cases. Look at Exxon. One of my very good friends is in the behavioral team somewhere, I can't say where. And he said to me, Exxon is the worst of the worst when it comes to safety. So that's my big methodological problem. I don't know a good case. I know a bad case. It may, I mean, I only know that there's no evidence yet that there is problems. So I don't know the worst case. The worst cases are bad but not known. Bad cases are known and at least are found out and we know something about. All the rest, I don't know. So, and yes, I've looked at the qualitative sort of thing. So I understand sort of the different sampling strategies. This is not it because we can't, so as I said, I can't do causality because I don't have that variation. So I can't even do, for instance.
Causality is not necessarily quality criteria.
No, I know.
This should set the word qualitative.
No, I know. But for instance, you can do qualitative comparative analysis.
Yeah.
A QCA, but then you need a variation in what they would still call something.
Yeah.
It's not called dependent variable, but
yeah.
So they use a different language. I'm just trying to simplify it. So yes, we only have bad cases. So that means what I said in the beginning. The second thing is another, which is also a qualitative criteria, is actually doing a very systematic analysis of all the data, for instance, through causal process tracing. As I said, that's possible to do, but to do it well is just too time consuming.
Yeah, like if you would look at, I don't know, it's community organizations or social, innovations with social purposes. Yeah. I imagine you find organizations do bad things, but you also find organizations that may be very hard to I mean,
take Save the Children. They've been abusing children in Haiti.
Yeah,
look, it's very, I mean, I can't, once, and this is also has to do, I think, with one of the worst things for me would be to find out later that I've analyzed the case as good and find out later that it's bad. So
then you start to wonder is there anything such as an organizational root cause? Because if any organization determined it, then it's maybe not an organizational thing, then maybe it's a human behavioral thing.
Well, I can at least see that sort of in the storytelling patterns in these cases. I see that there is more than just individuals. There are certain aspects that play the role there. Can I have methodologically sound evidence for that? No, because I don't have the
explanation. Might be, I don't know, neoliberal market paradigms in which all the cases might be situated. Maybe not church, by the way. Church is a different one.
No, I mean, which we do discuss. So that's where but you're right. I mean, this is why I started with it. I just didn't mention the positive case, but yeah, and that's a problem. I mean, everybody says this to me. I'm like, good luck. I don't see how you can solve the challenge there. But that's because
not all organizations are bad, right? Like, so I mean
it's just that exactly. I just don't know.
But maybe there's a degree of badness that you can.
I don't know.
No, but that's it. I would say.
I mean, look,
you can explore further.
I can give you a good example. I did my PhD on industry in China. One of the cases I studied was listed as a gold standard, fully green, fully compliant by the local regulator. I went to the village next to the factory, spent months and months and months going there, gradually got the trust. This was a case where there was structural, heavy pollution, people were getting sick, and in the end there was an explosion and 10 people died. Regulator didn't know. Nobody outside knew. Only through deep trust did I understand. That's what shaped my whole thinking about this. That's why I will never go where you are saying I should be going, because I don't believe it.
Yeah.
So I'd rather have a methodological limitation that I can talk about, than something where I fully am uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So
Fair enough.
I mean, it's up to others to say, okay, I mean, can I do something with this? And I'm also on the very, very careful saying, look, I think it's good to use these insights as a basis for conversation. Nothing wrong with that. You can talk about targets. It's a good thing to talk about. You can talk about, okay, you think you have silencing, what are maybe the process? What's also good about this is you have examples here in this study of, okay, this is where in this particular case it led to that and that. What I see with people in practice, those examples actually work very well. They work often better than sort of saying, well, there is a level of studies that have a significant relationship between A and B, where it's very abstract.
What's the role of power?
That's a good one.
Because I would expect it to be one of the five initially when you started. And this, there's examples of socioeconomic power, political power, physical power, cultural power. Sure.
So I've done a project on legal empowerment, and I spent 3 months operationalizing power at some point in my life. So I could apply that here. The problem is power is there's so many ways to operate it, and at some point it becomes nearly the same as causality. But yes, it could play a role here. I just didn't use that language.
Yeah, it is in your almost all of your part criteria.
Yeah, no, you're right, and also in the sort of macro context. Yeah, so that's a good question too, but would make it very, very, I mean, even more difficult for me. I mean, there's so many ways in which power can be operationalized here. I think the silencing chapter is the only one where we really talk about it, where we really talk about as a solution that it is core that there is worker empowerment, which comes through organization of workers themselves and freedom of association, etc. Other chapters, I think, were less directly, but you're right, it could be used anything. Like the fifth one, it's all discursive power.
So I'm conscious of time. We are at time now. I know we've got you for another hour. Steph, I think, is meeting with you, so maybe you can hold your questions, Steph, until we catch up. But I know some people need. There are 2 questions online, which I've said if they're happy to stay online, that you're happy to stay around and answer. So, and one you've been touching on, in fact, you touched on towards the end and then just then, which is around the role of leadership.
Yep.
How significant is the role of leadership in shaping, perpetuating poor organizational culture?
Yeah. So what I forgot to say in the beginning, often when there's big scandals like this, there's 2 responses. One is get the highest responsible person. So we go for the leader. Yeah, nice to meet you. And very good questions. The other one is that we look at the whole system. So Purdue Pharma, it's all about the sectors, or it's neoliberal capitalism. The Great Leap Forward, famine, it's all Mao Zedong, or it's a totalitarian communist system. And what the book argues is that in between is organization. However, leaders play a major role. Where are they most clearly at play? In all 5. But the clearest is targets. So targets are clearly, so our chapter on leaders, which I'm not presenting now, I think some of the insights that are interesting is it's not just higher level leaders, but also lower level leaders. That's one of the things that for me, there's different patterns. So yes, it can be also line managers that play a massive role in some of these cases. It's not just leaders, as I said earlier, setting the good example. We have cases where, for instance, if you look at BP, the CEO, late 1990s, early 2000s, the sort of speeches he did at commencement addresses in US universities, he sounds like somebody from Greenpeace. Literally, if you just read the text, it's so beautiful. He is saying that the big oil is responsible for climate change, and you've all these things, while the company at the time was doing some of the most horrible things. So leadership is everywhere, and it is a massive thing. Our book is not focused on leadership because there is such good work on leadership. But I think what is new is sort of to see, okay, where are leaders in these processes? That's where our focus is. So we're not talking about ethical leadership, or, well, we talk a little bit about dark triad, for instance, and but we didn't want to repeat that, but more show, okay, where are they present within these processes? And they're everywhere.
And last question online, which is a question about the role of regulators. So I've often heard people blame bad corporate behavior on lack of regulations rather than the corporates themselves. I find that very frustrating. That's what the Tal says. What should the role of regulators be here? What is the responsibility of?
So I think there's 2 sides to this. First are instances like, for instance, Monsanto that I mentioned, FAA, where you so clearly see, and also Purdue Pharma, a collusive, captured relationship with regulators, and where regulators just lack the independence and or capacity to take action or actually regulate. Some of that's well known, some is maybe less well known. So I think that's one part of it. The other part is, okay, how can regulators actually deal with organizations? And that's where a lot of my future work also looks at. And what I've seen, at least in the Netherlands, is that regulators are grappling with this. You have the sort of traditional models where you're saying, okay, we're going to use certain incentives that we have already had, to now move towards sort of the behavioral insights that are there, but increasingly they're talking about culture. And that's where I sort of get back to what I said earlier. I'd rather have that we have a deeper insight in organizational traits and processes before we jump on culture. Because culture is nearly impossible to establish well. I have a new paper that looks at ethical culture measurements, safety culture measurements, and two others, and we argue they neither measure culture nor do they predict this sort of really harmful conduct, because we don't have studies on that. What I'd rather have is that they go deeper into organizational traits. And you also just used the word culture. I see a lot of people use it sort of shorthand, but it obscures more, I think, than it explains. So I think that's the starting point, is to say, okay, what are organizations actually? And if I can give one piece of advice for reading, if people online are interested, it's a book called Images of Organization. It's a bit older, and it's beautiful because every chapter gives a different metaphor of what an organization is. Organization as a mechanism, as a machine. So that's sort of the incentives, and that's one way of it. Organization as an organism, which means, well, there's all parts of a body that are collaborating. Organization as a brain, it's all about information flows. And I found that book, even though it doesn't talk about these sorts of cases, a very good start, I think, for people to sort of get into the organizational mindset and add that onto the behavioral mindset. I think that's sort of the next step, is to sort of say, okay, we have the behavioral mindset, there's nothing wrong with it, it's really good. But let's see what happens if we add some of the organizational knowledge. And that starts with trying to see, okay, what actually is the essence of an organization. And one of the best things I've read about it was a book about artificial human and animal intelligence. And the book argues that we've had already a long-term artificial intelligence in the form of organizations. I don't know if you've ever felt that you're an organization, you feel somehow we all want something different, but still A keeps happening. I see that in university very often. But that's what I'm talking about. And it's not just the irrationality of it. There is a thing to organizations that sets them apart, that sort of, and yes, we can bog it down to individuals again. But once you sort of open your mind to, yes, there is something there, it's hard to grasp. There's different ways of into it. And that's where this book, Images of Organization, is really good starter, I think. Sorry?
Is the author that Andrew Van de Ven?
No, I would have to look at my laptop.
Okay.
Yeah. I can send the email with the reference.
All right, I'm conscious we probably should wrap up now, but again, thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
Great food for thought, really interesting, and keen to I hadn't read your book, but I'm keen to get hold of it now.
Well, this is a new book.
Yeah.
So I just
I've read your previous book.
Yeah. I just heard before this meeting that we got a contract with publishers. So
excellent.
I'm in a very good mood.
So it will be released soon.
Well, it'll be 1.5 years.
Okay. All right. Well, hopefully we can get on the mailing list nice and early. But thank you, Ben, and thanks, G, for sorting this out. And thank you for those online for joining in. Those that stuck around for a while.
You email me if you have questions. I'm not afraid of email.
Yeah.